I think hotels had a secret meeting recently. It was a very short meeting. Everyone flew in and they said, everybody here? All right, very quick. We're not gonna own any mistakes anymore. All right, that's it, head on back. How you doing? This key you gave me, I just tried it in my door, it's not working. Did you put it next to anything magnetic? No, you just gave it to me and I just tried it and I just came back. I was expecting a good key and an apology. And I'm holding a bad key and getting an accusation. Did you put the key next to anything magnetic? I am a red horseshoe magnet salesman. Okay. I know what happened now. I remember you gave me that perfectly good key, and I tossed that into my bag of samples. Then I scooped that up all haphazard-like and started swinging everything asunder. I remember hearing zipping and zapping. Was that the key becoming demagnetized?
When I think back on all the crap I learned in high school, it's a wonder I can think at all. And my lack of education hasn't hurt me none. I can read the writing on the wall. Kodachrome, they give us those nice bright colors, give us the greens of summers, makes you think all the world's a sunny day. Oh yeah, I got a nice.
How many people know growing up today what a Nikon camera is or Kodachrome? Nobody knows what Kodachrome film is anymore. It was made by the Kodak company, and I think you can buy it online. I think people still stockpile Kodachrome film. But you ask any high school person, do you know what Kodachrome film is? Not gonna know what Kodachrome film is. I don't think Steve knows what Kodachrome film is.
Yes, I most certainly do.
Okay. Just trying to find out how old you are there, Steve. I'm Don Rosen. Thanks for joining us here, 709 at WRJN Radio. Hometown Radio refreshed as civic media station. And Steve is going to enlighten you. He's part of a landmark here in Racine that you probably drove by a million times. You might have looked at it because it is kind of interesting to look at, but you probably don't know what's inside that building. And that's the Racine Firehouse Museum. And Steve Salvo works with the Racine Bells, which operate it, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, these are the Racine Bells. You see them in the 4th of July parade with the fire trucks, I guess. But they also have, like, I guess these were, they were like food trucks, I guess, when you went to the, what are those big van type trucks?
So the Racine Fire Bells are a nonprofit volunteer service organization.
And these are not this is not the baseball team.
Correct.
Okay.
No, there's no E on the end of bell.
Okay.
So the Fire Bells are a support auxiliary to local fire departments and police departments. So the vehicles that you're referring to are rehabilitation vehicles. The old term was canteen trucks.
Right, that's what I'm looking at. They use their food and stuff to the fire.
So they're actually, in most cases, they're typically old decommissioned ambulances that we are repurposing for that use. But the Fire Bells will show up at emergency scenes and provide water and coffee and Gatorade and snacks and such for police officers, firefighters that are going to be operating at a scene for long periods of time, especially in inclement weather like we've had in the last couple of days and so on.
Well, I digress from time to time in my interviews, and there was a Superman episode on the TV show Superman where just these trucks are called the Fireman's Friend. And these guys would come in the Fireman's Friend and serve coffee and everything to the firefighters and sandwiches and stuff because they're fighting these fires. Then they put on these fire retardant suits and going to rob the place while the fire was on, then come back and continue to serve food for the firemen. But that's not what the Racine Bells do.
Exactly.
That was it. That was in Superman, the TV series. Now, where is this building? It's a very unique looking building.
So the Firehouse Museum is located at 706th Street, which is in downtown Racine. We are just kind of kitty corner from Racine City Hall. We're right across the traffic circle from Racine City Hall.
Okay, then that's not the building I'm thinking of. I'm not thinking of the one that looks like a castle, but that's not this one.
Correct.
I know where the one you are now, because I think it was on the tour of homes at one time, the parade of homes. I think we actually went in there.
It's possible that it was.
Yeah.
So the building you're thinking of is actually Old Racine Fire Station number 1.
Okay, that's the one.
Which is at 1412 Racine Street.
Right.
And is currently owned by S.C. Johnson.
What do they do with it?
To my knowledge,
Storage?
I don't believe they do anything with it. It's theirs.
The
building is vacant. They own it, and I'm not aware that they use it for anything.
Okay, so this one is kitty corner from City Hall at 706th Street. It's an old building.
That it is.
It was built when?
It was built in 1881, and it served as an active fire station for the city of Racine until 1968.
Decommissioned and was too old for the serve as a fire station then?
So in 1968, actually 1967, the city built the safety building, the combined police and fire station, which they are still operating out of today. And at the time that facility opened in 1968, the city closed 3 fire stations. They closed Fire Station 1, which was the kind of castle building that you're referring to. They closed Fire Station number 3, which is our museum, and they closed what at the time was Fire Station number 5. It was their old headquarters station, which was located at 4th and Wisconsin, right across from the Journal-Times building. And they were able to close 3 buildings. This is kind of an interesting little tidbit. They were able to close 3 fire stations and combine them all into one building, because when those stations were originally built, they were built for horse-drawn fire apparatus. So they, out of necessity, had to be closer. Horses could only pull the heavy equipment so far. And so we moved to a period of time when all fire apparatus is motorized, and they realized they didn't need 3 fire stations in that one small footprint of area, so they were able to cover it all from the current safety building.
Do they have stables in those buildings for the horses?
Yes, as a matter of fact, they did. That's probably one of the things about the museum that I think most surprises people when they come through is the fact that the horses that pulled the fire apparatus actually lived in the building with the firefighters.
And in New York City, they have what they call the hansom cab rides. And they also have police on horseback in New York City. And people are shocked to find out there's actually a giant stable in Midtown Manhattan. And I say to them, what do you think they did with the horses at night? I mean, what, they take them to a farm upstate New York? No, they actually have a stable building. It looks like a farm. It's right in the middle of Manhattan. That's where they keep the animals. In the back of Radio City Music Hall, they also have stables, because when they do the nativity scene at Christmas time, they got to put the animals somewhere. And so they built stables in the rear of Radio City Music Hall. So they do have stables, and so
in the earliest days, the City of Racine, I believe, was founded in 1843, and the Racine Fire Department was founded right around that time. And in the earliest days, when the fire department was volunteer, they did board the horses at a nearby livery stable, because the firefighters were volunteers. There was nobody in the buildings to care for the horses around the clock, so the horses were boarded somewhere nearby. But once the fire department converted to a career fire department, the firemen were in the building 24/7, and so the horses were in the building 24/7. And if you come to the museum, you can still see some remnants of where they were.
I got to go there. Now that I know all this, I have to go check it out.
The most obvious, if you look, the majority of the building has a wood floor, and towards the back of the building, it transitions to concrete, and everything from the concrete back is what was originally the stables. The hayloft is still there. There's an opening in the floor. So the hayloft was on the second floor, and there's an opening, about a 4x4 foot square opening in the corner of the building, where the hay and oats and straw would be brought up to the second floor when they were delivered, and then they would be forked or shoveled down to the first floor stables as the horses needed it throughout the week. So,
You still got the fire pole there?
yes, we do.
You ever try it?
Years ago, we used to slide the pole routinely for school groups when they would come through, and our insurance carrier put a stop to that.
Really?
So, yes.
Is it that difficult? I've never tried it. So it looks easy. Just I mean, in gym when I was
It's
going
as
to
easy
high
as
school,
falling off of a log.
I mean, we used to do the ropes. We used to climb to the ceiling using the ropes, and then we slide down the ropes. It's got to be better than that because that burned when you wrapped it around your thighs and everything coming down too fast. But you still have, but you don't do the demos anymore.
Correct.
Oh, that's too bad. Now, when is it open to the public, by the way?
So we don't. We're a small organization. We don't have a lot of members, and as such, we don't have regular hours. So what we do is we do open for public events in Racine. Starting in April, we'll be open for First Fridays.
You do open. Okay, that's
we
good.
open on First Fridays again in the better weather. So typically from April through November, we're open for Party on the Pavement. Party on the Pavement is usually our biggest day of the year.
Yeah.
We typically get like 400 or 500 people through the museum during Party on the Pavement. We open for the downtown holiday parade and events like that. We also are more than happy to open for anywhere from one to any number of people. So I think in the past year, I probably gave 15 or more private tours. A lot of times we'll have retired firefighters' families will reach out and say, my dad was a firefighter for the fire department in these years, and so they'll come through the museum and such. So
I'm pretty sure I went through that with my wife as part of the Parade of Homes. I thought they brought us through the museum. I can almost swear to. I got to ask my wife about that. She would know more than I do. She has a much better memory than me. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about how you still accept members if people want to join the Racine Bells. We'll talk about that. I got so much to talk about with this and upcoming events and so forth. I'm floored that you were open that many times a year. Had I known that, I would have been in there. It's one of those hidden treasures in Racine people don't know about.
I think we really are. A lot of people will come in and just as you started this segment and said, I've walked past this building 1,000 times and I've never come in, or I've driven by it 1,000 times and I've never been in. People, they kind of think I'm not sure they think it's kind of a non-entity, but the reality is, we're actually open quite often, and it's...
Hold on a second.
Sure.
Steve Salvo's here from the Firehouse Museum here in Racine. More coming up. 719 WRJN, a civic media station. Hometown radio. Refreshed. It's 720 at WRJN Radio. Cloudy with 135 today. Possibly 1 to 2 inches of snow tonight. Lows around 27. Cloudy with 133 tomorrow. Right now, 33 degrees in Racine. It's cloudy, and Steve Salvo's here from the Racine Firehouse Museum. Now, how did the Racine Bells name come into that? It's called the Racine Firehouse Museum, right?
It's a Firehouse 3 museum.
Now, where's the 3 come from?
Because that was fire station number 3.
I'm slow, but not that slow. I'll catch on eventually. Let's talk about some of the exhibits you have there. And this goes back to the 1800s. And I always say that sounds old. My house goes back to just a little over the year 1900. I think 1906, 1910, something like that. But this is just a little older. This goes back to the 1800s. So tell us about some of the exhibits you have there.
So we're kind of excited. The most recent acquisition that we've got is a bell, and it's a bell from 1868, and back in 1868, there was a fire station. There was would have been a volunteer fire station at the time. It basically shared the playground with Jane's School on Main Street. And so this is the bell that hung in the tower of that fire station and would call the volunteers when there was a fire. And in 1888, by then, the Racine Fire Department had converted to a career or full-time fire department, and they moved that station. More accurately, I guess, they built a new station over at Lincoln and Barker Street, and they no longer had need for the bell. They donated the bell to the school. And so the bell has been in Jane's School since 1888. And so with Jane's School closing, we, as the museum, were well aware.
Are they closing?
Yes.
I live near Jane's School.
Yeah.
On Main Street. Oh, they're closing that, huh? They just redid it recently. They rebuilt a lot of the outside.
My understanding, yeah.
Wait, let this end. According to Steve Salvo.
So one of our one of the members of our organization works for Unified and was aware that the bell was there and was aware of its connection, to fire history in Racine, and so we reached out to Unified and eventually we're able to negotiate its return to the fire department and
where is it in the school? Where do they keep it?
I believe it was right in the front lobby.
So
was
people
never
could
in
see
that
it.
school,
Okay.
but yes, it was on display.
That's our version of the Liberty Bell.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Doesn't have the crack.
Okay.
Kind of interesting, and we're still kind of in the process of researching this. But again, the bell was cast in 1868, but in raised lettering on the bell, there's a reference. It says "Fireman's Pet." And we think that is sort of a little bit of an offhand shot at the school. In the 1800s, volunteer firefighters were not necessarily the most desirable role models for school children. And so there was always some tension between the school and the volunteer fire station. Again, I'm talking about 1860s, 1870s. And so we suspect that when they gave the bell to the school, that they had this Fireman's Pet line added on the bell because it's raised. It's not engraved like it would have been when the bell was new. It's raised, and we suspect that was a little bit of a kind of a shot at the school over the kind of poor relations that they'd had over the years. So
look at that. Okay, what else you got there?
So we're really fortunate. We have an 1882 Clappin Jones, which is the manufacturer, horse-drawn steam fire engine. To our knowledge, this is the only one of Racine's. At one time, Racine owned, I believe it was 6 steam fire engines. This is the only one still in existence. This particular piece of equipment has been in the possession of the Racine Fire Department its entire, so since 1882. We're just so fortunate that somebody through the years saw the foresight to keep this, to keep this somewhere. Many of these vehicles were simply sold for scrap, melted down. I have to imagine that during World War II, when there was metal shortages, somebody had to have looked at this and said, hey, there's metal in this that could be used for the war effort. But somebody saw the foresight to maintain this. Steam fire engines are quite rare. Off the top of my head, I'd say there's probably fewer than 100 of them in the United States still in existence.
And this is on display at the museum.
And this is on display in the museum, exactly.
You look at these old fire engines, when they portray them in movies, and you wonder how they ever put the fires out with those things. They weren't like high-pressure hoses like they have today, but you just wonder how did they ever put... And the city was made of wood, so everything was going up in flames back in those days. Like, when there was a major fire, there was a fire.
So, as a matter of fact, Racine's Great Fire was in May of 1882, and that's kind of what drove... Prior to that, Racine still had a volunteer fire department, and it was after the Great Fire of 1882. Just as you said, most of the buildings were built out of wood.
There were no fire codes either.
There were some, but they were quite
Yeah.
limited.
Yeah.
So the Great Fire of 1882 destroyed a good portion of downtown Racine, actually destroyed one of the volunteer firehouses, required assistance from Milwaukee Fire Department responded, the Kenosha Fire Department, the Chicago Fire Department actually came to render
what year was that?
assistance. 1882.
Okay. Well, let's see if I can find any photos of that. That must have been horrible to look at. I mean, when it was in flames. I mean, that's got to be the most frightening thing to see because it spreads. Yeah. Again, these buildings are made of wood, so it just spreads.
So it's not a coincidence that our steamer at the museum was manufactured in 1882. It was one of two steamers, I believe, that were purchased that year. After the Great Fire, the city realized that they had to improve their fire protection. Mm-hmm. And so they converted to a full-time fire department. They upgraded their equipment and such. So the museum building, which was built just before the fires, was built in 1881, was originally built for volunteer. Again, it was, at the time, the fire department was volunteer. But after the Great Fire, they started to convert to a career fire department. And so the museum was actually one of the first stations that housed full-time career firefighters in the city of Racine.
You have to think, too, were these horses spooked when they pulled up to these fires? It's got to be scary for these animals when they pull up to these giant flames and they just park the horses there while they put the fire out.
So fire horses are a little known but a fascinating aspect of history. Fire horses are legendary for their strength and for their loyalty and for their skill. These horses were actually highly trained.
Oh, were they? Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Hold on a second. We're going to continue that. That's fascinating. I never knew they had specially trained horses for this. Because I always wonder, they pull up to these fires and these horses don't seem to be spooked. Steve Salvo's here, the Racine Firehouse Museum. And that's located on 6th Street. We'll talk more about where you can find it. It's 729 at WRJN Radio, a civic media station. Hometown radio. Refreshed. Stay where you are. At WRJN, Steve Salvo's here with me, and he's one of the people responsible for the Firehouse Museum, which is located at 706th Street, kitty corner from City Hall. I got the mayor coming in Friday. I'll see what he knows about this. I'll put him on the spot right there. Mayor, you go to work every day. You can probably see it out his window. We'll see what he knows about it. So we were talking before we left about these horses, because I would have suspected that these horses would have been spooked when you bring them up to a fire, with all the noise and all the flames. And, horses would get spooked by that stuff. You say they're specially trained. Let's continue talking about that.
Yeah, so the fire horses were considered. It's kind of hard, I think, to understand this in our modern times here, but in the time of horse-drawn fire apparatus, the firefighters, quite honestly, were considered dime a dozen. They'd be hired off the street. All their training was on the job. Some would take to the job and would work for 30 or 40 years, and others would quit after a week or so. The horses, on the other hand, they had to be trained to carry out their duties. The horses cost significant amount of money, so the horses were viewed as a much more valuable asset, if you can believe it, than the firemen actually were. When they returned from a fire, if it was 10 degrees outside, it didn't matter how cold the firemen were. It didn't matter how wet they were. The horses had to be taken care of first. The horses had to be exercised. The horses had to be wiped down. The horses had to be fed and watered. Then the firemen could think about taking care of their own needs. So to your question about whether they were frightened by the exposure to the fire and such, to a certain extent, that was trained out of them. But at the same time, there was the person responsible for getting the apparatus to the scene. So the driver, once it got to the scene, did not actually typically fight the fire. The driver would take responsibility for the horses, and if necessary, that meant unhitching the horses from the apparatus, covering them, leading them away to a safe area. A lot of times the bigger concern was if there was smoke. They couldn't leave the horses where they would be exposed to the smoke, so they'd have to walk the horses upwind of the fire to where they'd be away from the fire, and then the driver would stay with the horses and maintain their safety.
That's a lot of work.
It is,
You're
yeah.
supposed to be fighting the fire, and you got to take care of the horse. Well, that's the driver you said did that.
That would have been the driver.
Yeah.
Nowadays, the person who drives the fire apparatus also operates the fire apparatus. And in the time of the horse-drawn era, that was actually two separate jobs. So I've mentioned the steam fire engine that we have in the museum, and that required an engineer to operate the boiler on that machine, on that piece of apparatus. Much like an engineer to this day still maintains the boiler in a school or the boiler in some public building or whatever. So, but again, at that time, you had a driver who was responsible for getting the vehicle there and taking care of the horses. And then the engineer was responsible for mechanically operating the steam fire engine. And then you had hosmen who would be the firemen actually applying the water onto the fires.
Now, how did they get the water out? It was steam operated, you said. So was it steam pressure that pushed the water out to get onto the fire?
Yeah, so it's a steam engine, much like a steam locomotive would move. The steam boiler, the steam engine provided the propulsion. It did not move the vehicle, but it moved the pump. It operated the pump. So the water would be, at one time, it would have had to have been drafted, drawn from either the lake or the river or a cistern. Cisterns were basically holes in the street, brick-lined like a well, if you will, that the firemen could drop a hard suction hose into and draw or draft the water out of that static water source. It wasn't until 1886, 1887 that Racine started to get fire hydrants to where the fire department could just hook up to a fire hydrant and get water that way. Otherwise, it had to come from a static water source.
This is a lot of work to fight a fire.
Yes, it is.
Back then. Now they pull up the truck, they hook up to a fire hydrant.
Well,
it's still a lot of work. But
I'm a retired firefighter for 33 years, and I'll tell you, it's still a lot of work.
Yeah, but you didn't have to worry about a horse. You didn't have to worry. I mean, there are a lot of things you had to be concerned about in the 1800s before you could even get the first water out. You got to worry about you got a live animal here.
Yes.
And he's got to take you home.
Yes. Kind of an interesting story about the horses, too, is that the horses, when they were no longer fit for fire duty, because these steam fire apparatus were quite heavy to pull, they had to be retired. They couldn't be sold to, for example, the dairy to pull a dairy wagon, because if a retired fire horse was pulling a dairy wagon down the street and the fire rigs went by, that retired fire horse was going to, you could not untrain a fire horse from being a fire horse. So they had to be retired basically to pasture where they would not be exposed to that anymore. So there's a lot of documented instances of that.
This is fascinating stuff. This is stuff people don't really. You see these old movies or old photographs of old, horse-drawn fire apparatus, and you don't think what goes into this stuff, because this is an animal. It's not like a truck you pull into a garage, give it an oil change, and polish it up, and it's set. And it doesn't need really anybody staying with it overnight. Well, animals do.
Physically, it is an animal, but these horses were beloved by the men that worked with them.
How many were at each firehouse?
So Because Racine is a relatively flat city, the steamers could be pulled by 2 horses. If you went to, larger cities or cities with more hills in them, it was not uncommon to see a 3-horse hitch. Pardon the pun, but they needed the extra horsepower to pull that up the hills and such. So Racine managed with 2. So along with the steamer, there had to be a hose cart that responded along with, because the steamer simply carried the pump. And that's all it was. It didn't have hose for spraying the water on the fire. It didn't carry nozzles or any type of tools. So a separate hose cart had to run with the steam fire engine.
Brother.
So 2 horses would pull the steamer and 2 horses would pull the hose cart. Half the crew would ride on the steamer, half the crew would ride on the hose cart. So to answer your question, our building, the Firehouse 3 Museum, had four stables. So there would, at one time, there would have been 4 horses.
Now, how much water did each pumper hold? I mean, couldn't have held that much water. And there were I don't think there were fire hydrants around in those days, were there? You said there were cisterns in the street.
Correct. So the steam fire engines carried no water for firefighting. The only water they carried was the water that was in the boiler that was heated to produce steam that operated the pump. So they, unlike today's modern fire apparatus, which carry anywhere from 500, maybe 750 gallons of water or more, these steamers, the only water they carried was the water that produced the steam that moved the pump.
But you can hook up to a fire hydrant today and get unlimited water, just about.
Right, and Racine's water system dates back to, again, I think it's like 1887. One of the interesting things we have in the museum is we have a piece of Racine's original wooden water main. So the water mains, and this is common in most places, were originally...
I think, don't they still have some wooden ones underground in Racine?
Well, this was extricated. So to give a little bit of background to this, so about some of your viewers, listeners, will probably be aware that Party on the Pavement dates back to when 6th Street was all torn up for construction. And the construction took, I think, close to 2 years to complete. And when the construction was done, the merchants along 6th Street were so happy the construction was finally done, they threw a party. And that was actually the first Party on the Pavement.
We used to joke about that, saying, we finally have a new street for cars. I'll tell you what, first day, let's close it down to all vehicles.
And so while 6th Street was torn up for construction, Racine firefighters from Station 1 downtown would frequently walk down there to see what their accessibility was, because it was such a mess. So on a daily basis, they'd have to see what accessibility they had if there was a fire. And one day they're walking down there and they see this piece of wooden water main being unearthed from underground. The construction workers had no idea what it was, but thankfully the firemen did, and so they arranged to have it brought over to the museum where it's on display.
Look at
now.
that, just by accident. Yeah, that's great. I want to get this question in because I don't want to miss it. I heard, and it wasn't in Racine that I heard it, but at the top of firehouses, they had like a lookout thing on the roof, and people used to just stand up there and look for fires because there was no telephone system back, then where people can call in and say 911. Didn't exist. So does that firehouse have a lookout tower? I know the one that you said S.E. Johnson owns has a lookout tower, and that's what that castle lookout thing is. And the city was relatively small. There weren't skyscrapers or any tall buildings so they can see around it. Is that what they have one?
So yes, that was a common feature of firehouses in Racine at prior to the turn of the century, the last century.
Yeah, the last turn.
1800. Yeah,
the one before this one.
The turn before this one, exactly. So the Firehouse 3 Museum did have a watchtower. Originally, it was considerably taller than what's there now. There was a wooden tower that extended up almost 4 stories. At some point, and we're not real clear on this, at some point, when the tower was no longer needed, it was removed, and I like to joke now we have a stubby tower now, but that is not the actual tower. It looks almost there's a railing around it that almost kind of gives the impression that it could have been the tower, but it is not the original tower that a fireman would have walked watch around.
Was that manned 24/7?
We're not sure. I suspect it was probably manned mostly at night when people would have been asleep and would not have been, there would not have been pedestrian traffic out to kind of become aware of fires occurring. So, but we do have, one of the things we're lucky at the museum is we do have a lot of old photographs, and we have a lot of photographs of that station at that time that shows the original tower. We have pictures showing the original stables. The stables have been removed from the building. You can tell where they were, but once the fire department motorized, they had no need for the stables. And so you can understand that they would have removed the stables to create more room in the building for their everyday operations. But we have pictures showing the horses that worked out of that building, the stables as they appeared, and a lot of great photographic history of the...
And you have the photographs hanging up there,
yes,
right?
Yes, they're on display.
And you can't lose these things. And I could tell you about stories about radio stations losing valuable stuff because you don't think it's important at the time, so you just toss it. People always talk about the good old days going back to the 1800s. Oh, what a simpler time. It was too simple. I mean, this story just explains how simple it was. I mean, now a fire truck shows up, they hose down the fire, and it's done. It was a whole, to quote my mother in her Yiddish, it's a whole mishigas when you wanted to fight a fire back in the 1800s. It wasn't that simple. You dealt with horses, you dealt with boiler trucks, you dealt with hose trucks, and you had to assemble all this stuff when you got to the fire.
And again, for my... current firefighters that are still working out there. It's not easy today.
No, it's not easy today.
But yeah, there were certainly elements of, yes, exactly. I'm continually amazed by the level of technology that existed in the 1800s. So I think, again, a lot of your listeners might be surprised to know that from the time a fire call was received in the fire station until these horse-drawn apparatus were on the street and responding, this could be done in just about 1 minute of time. So they're hitching up these horses.
I'm sure they had it down to a science.
Well, there's
hold it right there. We're
Sure.
going to pick up right where you left off in just a moment here. It's 7:49 at WRJN Radio, a civic media station. Hometown Radio, refreshed. More with Steve Salvo from the Firehouse Museum in Racine. Coming up in just a moment at WRJN Radio, 1400 AM, 99.9 and 98.1 FM. At 7:52 at WRJN, Steve Salvo from the Racine Firehouse Museum, which is located kitty corner from City Hall at 706th Street. And we'll tell you again when you can tour the facility. It should be on a must-see list in Racine because you drive by it all the time and you say, oh, that's an interesting building. I wonder if they store things there. Yeah, they store history in there. That's what they store there. And I interrupted you. Do you remember where you were?
Yes, I was talking about how quickly the firefighters at that time could respond with horse-drawn apparatus. And what they used was what was called a hanging hitch or a suspended hitch. The harness would be suspended from the ceiling on a system of counterweights. And the horses were in their stall at the back of the building. And when a fire alarm was received, there was always a fireman on watch. And if anybody notices, yes, I'm using the word fireman because in the 1800s they were firemen. They didn't become firefighters until, quite more recently here. But so firemen in the 1800s, there was always someone on watch at the watch desk. And we still have our watch desk at the Firehouse 3 Museum. But when an alarm would come in, the fireman on watch would pull a cord, and that released an electromagnet on the stable doors. And the stable doors would open, and the horses were trained. We talked earlier about how well trained these horses were, and they were trained to take their spot exactly where they needed to be. 2 horses in front of the steam fire engine, 2 horses in front of the hose cart. The fireman on watch would then pull another cord, and that would release the counterweights, and that would allow the harness to drop onto the all 4 horses' backs, basically simultaneously. All they had to do was close the collar around each horse's neck, attach the reins, and they could be out the door. That's how they were able to respond in as little as sometimes like 1 minute of time, which to me is just unfathomable to get a horse going where you want them to be going that quickly. So
I found a picture of the Racine fire.
Okay.
That's downtown Racine after it was all burned out. Those buildings still there? Where was that? Do you know where that was?
I would have to look a little bit harder. It looks like it's probably about the 300 block of Main, I would guess. So it's quite likely those buildings, you notice those, it's the brick, the masonry buildings are the ones that survived the fire.
Yeah, and you look at some of these pictures here. They have the Racine fire. This is the one. Is this the one that's on...
So that
Racine
is
Street?
No, that is Station 2. That is Old Fire Station 2, which is on State Street. And honestly, looking at that picture, I'm not sure. There were 2 stations on that lot.
But you look what's out in front of it.
And there's the horses, exactly. It's very similar. We have that picture at the museum.
Like, do you really?
Oh, yes.
Probably where they got it from. Racine Fire Department, a legacy of courage. Yeah, that's they're the horses sitting there just waiting for the next fire. I want to get some of the stuff in before we leave here. Well, let's get this stuff in first. You have a website online so people can read about it because I brought it up already. So, and what's the website?
So the Firehouse 3 Museum again is operated by the Racine Fire Bell. So you can find out about us and contact us through our Fire Bell pages. So the Racine Firebell Club is on Facebook, and then we have, if you just Google Racine Firebell Club, you'll find a website. We have a web presence, and then I can also give your listeners an email address if they want to reach out to us specifically to tour the museum. So, and again, we're more than happy. Other than, again, we open for public events, First Friday, Party on the Pavement, things like that. But we are more than happy to open for even one person if they want to come through.
Nice. And by the way, if you Google Racine Fire Museum, you'll also come up with the website. Yeah. Google will help you find anything in the world.
Exactly.
And your next big event is coming up May 3rd. It's going to be Party on the Pavement.
No, Party on the Pavement is always in September. Party on the Pavement, right. I think, is the 3rd Saturday in September.
First Friday.
So it'd be first Friday.
I'm slow. It's early in the morning. I don't handle mornings well. You have to understand that. I've only been doing it for 30-some-odd years. I'll get used to it. Yeah, it's First Fridays in downtown Racine, May 3rd. Party on the Pavement is the 3rd Saturday in September. And you're open for those events, plus other events, too.
Yes. For example, like this year we opened for the Downtown Holiday Parade, which runs right past the front of the building.
Yeah, and it's one of those things people drive past all the time. They never give it a second look. And that's not the only thing you drive past in Racine. There's so much history. We're all driving past every day. We pay no attention to what we're looking at here. Well, this has just been fascinating. And how long you've been a firefighter for the city of Racine, right?
No, I'm actually retired. I was.
But you were?
Yeah. I was with the Mount Pleasant Fire Department, and then we converted to the South Shore Fire Department. So I'm retired after 33 years of service with the Village of Mount Pleasant.
There are 2 jobs I wouldn't want. and that's police and firefighting. Only because it looks dangerous, which it is. You have to deal with such devastation all the time, and I just wouldn't want to deal with something like that. And I'm glad there are people like you that do. So now you're retired, and it's your hobby. It's your retirement hobby, right?
Yeah, actually, I've actually been a member of the Fire Bells longer than I was a firefighter. I became a firefighter in 1988, and I've been a Fire Bell since I think 1985, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, Steve, you're welcome here anytime.
Thank you.
And when these events come up, I want to get a hold of you again just to remind people, because people have a short memory. Steve Salvo from the Racine Fire Bells, which runs the Firehouse Museum.
Correct.
All right, I have the order here now. This is like I told them when they do the mafia in court, they got to have the big chart, the capo de capos. They get down to the main guy. That's what this is. So I'm glad you guys are handling it, because we can't let history go by. History's got to be part of our fabric, and I'm glad this is happening here. Thank you very much, Steve. I do appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I'm Don Rosen. Back tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., bright and early. Tomorrow we're talking winter driving safety with the Racine Police Department. Christy Wilcox, the sergeant with the Racine Police, is going to be here. It's all at WRJN Radio, a hometown radio refreshed, a civic media station.